by a group. Many years later she returned.
Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
You have to finish. Philip is bread, Isabel, Mr. Philip said kindly as he placed the plate on the old wooden table. Isabel, Mr. Philip's only daughter, was the center of his world. Isabel nodded, her large, round eyes gazing at her father with love and gratitude. She understood well the sacrifices her father had made. Mr. Philip, a poor farmer, had lost his wife when Isabel was just a child. He poured all his love and energy into raising her, always dreaming of a better future for his daughter. In the village, people often admired the bond between father and daughter. Señora Carmen, an elderly neighbor, often said, "Mr. Philip is truly a model father. Not everyone is willing to do everything for their child like he does." But life here was far from easy. The village was under the control of a wealthy landlord family. Farmers like Mr. Philip had to toil endlessly to make a living, while the upper class lived in luxury. This injustice always weighed on Mr. Philip's mind, but he never let Isabel see his worries. One day, while Isabel was watering the flowers in front of their house, Alexander appeared. He rode a horse, dressed in expensive clothes that radiated arrogance. Alexander, the only son of the landlord, was infamous for his haughty personality and habit of looking down on others. "Hello, Isabel," Alexander called out, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Making this place look prettier, are you? It's a shame that no amount of effort can change the fact that it's so poor." Isabel didn't respond, keeping her head down and continuing her work. But Alexander wasn't one to give up easily. He dismounted his horse and walked toward her. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Don't you feel honored to have my attention?" Mr. Philip emerged from the house, his gaze wary. "Alexander, excuse me, but Isabel has work to do. You should leave." Alexander shrugged, returned to his horse, but not before turning back and calling out loudly, "Isabel, I'll be back. We're not done yet." In the days that followed, Alexander kept showing up at Isabel's home. He persistently tried to capture her attention, bringing expensive gifts and making empty promises. Isabel refused all of it, but Alexander wouldn't give up. He was used to having everything his way and couldn't tolerate resistance. One afternoon, while Isabel was picking fruit in the garden, Señora Carmen came to visit. "Isabel, you need to be careful with Alexander. I don't trust him. Someone like him will never bring good things." "I know, Señora Carmen," Isabel replied softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I don't know what to do. He always shows up unannounced, and I'm afraid my father will get into trouble if he angers him." Señora Carmen held Isabel's hand, her eyes filled with concern. "If anything happens, come to me. Don't keep it to yourself." However, Alexander's harassment didn't stop there. One evening, when Mr. Philip had gone to the fields to check the crops, Alexander and his wealthy friends came to Isabel's house. He called out loudly from the yard. "Isabel, I just want to talk. Why are you avoiding me?" Isabel trembled but stood at the door, her eyes firm. "Alexander, I've made myself clear. I want nothing to do with you." But Alexander wouldn't leave. He stared at her, anger flashing across his face. "Do you think you can reject me? You're just the daughter of a poor farmer, while I am Alexander. You should know your place." At that moment, Mr. Philip returned. He rushed forward to stand in front of Isabel, his face angry. "Alexander, I'm asking you to leave immediately." Alexander laughed but finally left with his friends. Before leaving, he made sure to issue a threat, "Don't think this is over." Isabel watched Alexander disappear into the night, her heart heavy with worry. Mr. Philip placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and steady, "Don't be afraid. I'll protect you no matter what." But Isabel knew that in this village, Alexander and his family's power was absolute. No matter how hard her father tried, could he truly protect her from Alexander's malicious schemes? That afternoon, the sky was overcast, as if foretelling something ominous. Isabel sat in the small kitchen, her hands trembling as she clutched an old cloth tightly. Mr. Philip sat beside her, his troubled gaze fixed on his daughter. Alexander's constant appearances weighed heavily on him. "Isabel, you can't stay home alone anymore. I'll arrange for Senora Carmen to stay with you whenever I go to the fields." Mr. Philip tightened his calloused hand. Isabel nodded softly, her eyes red. "I'll be fine, father. Alexander won't do anything." But even Isabel didn't believe her own words. Alexander's cold, piercing gaze haunted her, along with his smirk full of defiance. She could feel the threat in every word he spoke. Night fell quicker than usual, the sky pitch black without a single star. Mr. Philip went outside to lock the door securely before retiring to bed. But in the stillness of the night, a strange noise came from the yard. Clack, clack. Isabel startled. The soft but deliberate sound of footsteps echoed outside. She nervously approached the window and carefully peeked through the curtain. In the darkness, she caught a glimpse of a figure moving stealthily. Her heart pounded. Suddenly, the wooden door shook violently. Bang! Bang! A familiar voice rang out, cold and threatening. "Isabel, open the door. I just want to talk." Isabel backed away, trembling. It was Alexander. Without thinking, she ran to her father's room and shook him awake. "Father! Alexander is at the door." Mr. Philip jumped up, grabbing a wooden stick. He rushed to the door, his voice filled with anger. "Alexander! Get away from here immediately." Alexander's laugh rang out, cold and arrogant. "Old man, you think you can protect her? This is my village." A loud noise erupted, as if someone had kicked the door. Mr. Philip stood firm, his gaze unyielding despite his age. "You're not allowed to enter my house." "Leave," he said, enunciating every word. Alexander sneered. "Fine, I'll leave for now. But next time, I won't come alone." Alexander left, but his threat lingered in Isabel's mind all night. She couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in fear. A few days later, while Mr. Philip was busy in the fields, Isabel was home alone. The quiet atmosphere made her uneasy. Just then, Lucia, a young woman from the village, knocked on the door. "Isabel, I heard Alexander plotting something with his friends." "You must be careful," Lucia whispered, her eyes full of concern. Isabel trembled. "Thank you, Lucia. I'll be careful." Lucia held Isabel's hand and squeezed it gently. "If you need anything, come to me. I'm not like the others in this village." Isabel nodded slightly, a small warmth rising in her heart amidst the overwhelming gloom. But that peace did not last long. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Alexander and his group of friends appeared. They were not loud but stood silently in front of Isabel's gate. Alexander stared straight at the house, his gaze cold and sharp. "Today, we're taking her," Alexander said quietly to his friends, his voice icy. Isabel was sweeping the yard when she froze, noticing shadows lurking nearby. She stepped back, her heart pounding. But before she could react, the gate was flung open. Alexander and 3 of his friends rushed in, giving her no chance to escape. Alexander grabbed Isabel's arm and yanked her forcefully. "Come with me, Isabel. Don't test my patience. Let me go." Isabel struggled, tears streaming down her face. But he was stronger. One of his friends, a man named Mark, urged, "Hurry up, Alexander. It's getting dark." They dragged Isabel out of the house, heading toward an abandoned house on the outskirts of the village. Isabel cried out for help, but no one came. The villagers who saw what was happening turned their faces away, not daring to intervene. At the abandoned house, Alexander shoved Isabel to the ground. You think you're better than me? Now you'll learn your place. Isabel, terrified, tried to get up but was held down. A wave of utter fear consumed her. Alexander and his friends crossed the line, making her a victim of their cruelty and abuse of power. When it was over, Alexander stood up and adjusted his jacket. If you dare tell anyone, I'll make your father pay. Remember that. Isabel lay motionless, tears streaming down her face. The pain, both physical and emotional, left her unable to speak. The next morning, Mr. Philip saw Isabel returning home, her body weak, her clothes disheveled. He rushed to her, alarmed. Isabel. What happened? Isabel didn't answer, only clinging to her father and sobbing uncontrollably. Mr. Philip held her tightly, his heart breaking. He understood that the worst had happened. Mr. Philip's eyes turned red with rage. He roared, I won't let them get away with this. I'll seek justice for you. But deep down, he knew he was just a poor farmer. How could he fight against a powerful family like Alexander's? In the following days, rumors spread throughout the village. Alexander and his friends fabricated a story, claiming Isabel had been willing, that she had tried to seduce Alexander. The villagers began to gossip, their disdainful eyes turning toward Isabel. I heard she went after Alexander herself, one woman whispered. A girl like that deserves it, another added. Isabel shrank away whenever she went outside, her eyes full of fear. Mr. Philip tried to seek justice, but every door was closed to him. Alexander's family had used their wealth and power to silence everyone. Isabel felt as though she had fallen into a bottomless abyss. She no longer had a place in the village where she was born. Mr. Philip stood silently in front of Alexander's house, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. He had hesitated all night, but the pain and anger drove him here. He couldn't let his daughter live in shame without doing something. The door opened slowly, revealing Matteo, the old butler of the landlord's family. Matteo looked at Mr. Philip with cold, contemptuous eyes. Mr. Philip, what are you doing here? Matteo asked gruffly. I need to see Senor Stephen, Mr. Philip said firmly. I must speak to him about his son. Matteo sneered. Who do you think you are to demand a meeting with the master? Go home, Mr. Philip. Don't waste anyone's time. Mr. Philip gritted his teeth and pushed the door open wider. I'm not leaving. I can't let my daughter suffer this injustice. The commotion drew the attention of Stephen, Alexander's father, who descended the stairs. He was dressed in a luxurious suit, exuding authority and coldness. His gaze swept over Mr. Philip as if looking at something insignificant. What's going on, Matteo? Stephen asked, his voice low but commanding. Matteo bowed slightly. Senor, Mr. Philip is here to talk about Alexander. Stephen raised an eyebrow, then slowly descended the staircase. Philip, you've come to my house unannounced. What do you want? Mr. Philip clenched his fists tightly. I want justice for my daughter. Alexander has harmed her. You can't ignore this. Stephen laughed coldly. Justice? What are you talking about? Your daughter went to Alexander willingly, and now you're blaming my son. No. Isabel would never do that. Alexander and his friends forced her. Mr. Philip shouted, his voice trembling with anger. Stephen smirked. Do you have any proof? Or are these just baseless accusations? Mr. Philip was silent. He knew that in this village, the word of a poor farmer would never hold weight against someone as powerful as Stephen. Stephen stepped closer, his eyes sharp and cold. I advise you to be careful with your words. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. Mr. Philip stood frozen, the words cutting into him like knives. He couldn't do anything more. He was powerless. Stephen turned away and said coldly, Matteo, show him out. Mr. Philip stepped back, his heart heavy. He knew that justice was a distant dream for someone like him. Rumors about Isabel spread through the village like wildfire. Malicious gossip followed her everywhere. "I heard she tried to seduce Alexander," a middle-aged woman whispered to her friend. "Of course. A poor girl dreaming of marrying into a rich family," another sneered. As Isabel walked through the market, she felt the weight of disdainful stares. She pulled her headscarf lower, trying to avoid their gaze. But the murmurs followed her everywhere. Lucia, the only person still standing by Isabel, ran up to her. "Isabel, don't go out anymore. They're cruel." Isabel shook her head slightly, her voice trembling. "I can't keep hiding. But I'm scared." Lucia held her hand tightly. "If they do anything, I'll protect you." Though Lucia's words brought some warmth, Isabel couldn't shake off the fear and shame. She felt like an outcast in the very village where she was born. That night, Mr. Philip sat silently by the flickering oil lamp. Isabel sat beside him, her eyes empty. "Isabel," Mr. Philip's voice was hoarse. "Perhaps we should leave this place." Isabel looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Father, where would we go? I have a cousin in the city. He once invited me to work there. We'll start over." Isabel clasped her father's hands tightly. "I don't want you to suffer more because of me." Mr. Philip gave a faint, sorrowful smile. "You are everything to me. We can't live under this scorn forever." Isabel nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew leaving was their only option. As painful as it was, she couldn't endure the villagers' contempt any longer. The next morning, Mr. Philip packed a few old clothes into a tattered cloth bag. Isabel stood silently by the door, gazing at the house one last time. This was once their home, filled with memories, but now it was nothing more than a cold, desolate place. Lucia ran over, breathless. "Isabel. Are you really leaving?" Isabel nodded slightly. "I have no other choice." Lucia held her hand tightly, her eyes filled with sadness. "I'll miss you. But I believe one day, you'll return stronger." Isabel tried to smile, but her eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for not turning your back on me." Mr. Philip placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Let's go, Isabel." They left the village in silence, with only Lucia watching as their figures faded down the dusty road. No one else came to see them off, no words of farewell were spoken. They were enveloped in solitude. But within Isabel, a fire had been kindled, a fire of determination and resentment. She vowed that one day, she would return. Not to seek pity but to reclaim justice and restore her honor. The sprawling city unfolded before Isabel and Mr. Philip like an entirely different world. Bustling streets, the cacophony of carriages and wagons, and hurried people passing by, it was all alien to them. Isabel gripped her father's hand tightly as they stepped off the cheap hired cart. Mr. Philip looked around, his expression filled with worry. "Isabel, we need to find a place to stay first. Then, we'll look for Ramon." Isabel nodded, exhausted but determined to remain strong. Ramon was Mr. Philip's distant cousin, who had once sent an invitation to work in the city. He was their only hope now. They found a small room in a run-down neighborhood. The damp, cramped space was just large enough for a wooden bed and a tiny table. But for Isabel, it was a safe haven compared to the village full of cruel gossip. The next morning, Mr. Philip took Isabel to find Ramon. After asking for directions multiple times, they finally arrived at a small house tucked away in an alley. Ramon, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, opened the door, surprised to see Mr. Philip. "Philip? Good heavens, what are you doing here?" Ramon asked, his tone carrying a hint of suspicion. Mr. Philip sighed. "Ramon, Isabel and I need help. We can't stay in the village anymore." Ramon looked at Isabel, noticing the deep sadness in her eyes. After a moment of silence, he nodded. "Come inside. I'll help however I can." Inside the modest house, Mr. Philip told Ramon everything. Ramon listened intently, his face growing more solemn with each detail. "That landlord's family is despicable. But it's not easy to find work here, Philip." Mr. Philip sighed deeply. "I'm willing to do anything." Ramon thought for a moment before saying, "I know a blacksmith, Señor Antonio. You could ask him for work." As for Isabel, he hesitated, glancing at her apologetically. "It's hard for women to find jobs here unless they have skills." Isabel clenched her fists. "I'll do anything, cleaning, washing, selling goods. I'm not afraid of hard work." Ramon nodded slightly. "All right, I'll ask around and see if anyone needs help." The following days were grueling for Isabel. She wandered the streets, searching for work, but everywhere she went, she faced judgmental stares. "I'm sorry, we're not hiring," a bakery owner said coldly. "You're too frail for heavy work," a fruit vendor remarked, shaking his head. Exhausted and disheartened, Isabel's legs felt like lead. Each rejection was a dagger to her heart. But she refused to give up. She couldn't let her father endure more suffering because of her. Finally, Isabel found a job at a small eatery owned by Señora Rosa, a middle-aged widow. Señora Rosa seemed stern but not unkind. "Do you know how to wash dishes and clean up?" Señora Rosa asked. Isabel nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am, I can do that." Señora Rosa studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right. Start tomorrow. The pay's not much, but at least you'll have a meal." Isabel bowed her head gratefully, tears threatening to spill. At last, she had found a place to begin again. On her first day of work, Isabel threw herself into her tasks without hesitation. She washed dishes, wiped tables, and tidied the kitchen. Though the work was hard and her hands blistered from the cold dishwater, she persevered. Señora Rosa, initially skeptical, gradually grew satisfied with Isabel's diligence. One evening, as Isabel was wiping down tables, a group of young men entered the eatery. Their loud laughter echoed through the room. Isabel glanced over and recognized one of them, Ernesto, the son of a local merchant. Ernesto's gaze landed on her, and he smirked. "Hey, isn't that Isabel from St. Mary?" Ernesto said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Isabel froze, her hands trembling. The murmurs began immediately. "That's her, isn't it? I heard she had some scandal with Alexander," one voice whispered. "Yes, I heard she's trouble," another chimed in. Isabel kept her head down, trying to focus on her work. But Ernesto wasn't finished. He stood up and approached her. "So, Isabel, how's it going? Did you come to the city to find someone else to replace Alexander?" he sneered, laughing loudly. His friends joined in, their mocking laughter filling the room. Señora Rosa emerged from the kitchen, her sharp eyes glaring. "Ernesto, this isn't a place for you to make trouble. If you're not here to eat, leave." Ernesto paused, irritated. "Fine, Señora Rosa. I don't want to eat in this filthy place anyway." He tossed a few coins onto the table and left, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Isabel stood motionless, her eyes brimming with tears. Señora Rosa approached her and gently patted her shoulder. "Don't let them get to you. You're doing a good job. Don't let trash talk discourage you." Isabel nodded slightly, gratitude swelling in her heart. But deep inside, the humiliation lingered. Ernesto's taunts were like fuel, igniting the flames of her resentment. She vowed that she would no longer allow herself to be looked down upon. One day, she would rise above it all. Time passed, and Isabel gradually adjusted to her work. She labored diligently, saving every penny she could. Mr. Philip also worked tirelessly at the blacksmith shop, though his health was steadily declining. Still, he persevered for his daughter's sake. One evening, Isabel sat beside her father in their cramped room. She looked at his calloused hands, her heart aching. "Father, we'll escape this life. I promise," Isabel said softly, her eyes filled with determination. Mr. Philip smiled wearily. "All I want is for you to be happy." But Isabel knew happiness wouldn't come unless she fought for it. She didn't want to merely survive, she wanted to reclaim what Alexander had taken from her. With each passing day, her hatred grew, forging an unshakable resolve. While Isabel and Mr. Philip struggled to make ends meet in the unfamiliar city, Alexander continued to live in luxury and power back in St. Mary. He felt no guilt or remorse for what he had done to Isabel. To him, it had been nothing more than a game, and Isabel was just a discarded toy. In the lavish banquet hall of the Stephen estate, Alexander lounged in a leather armchair, a glass of red wine in hand. He chuckled as Mark, one of his accomplices, recounted the gossip about Isabel in the village. "They say she's fled the village," Mark sneered. "Probably too ashamed to stay." Alexander sipped his wine, his expression indifferent. "Pathetic. Just think, a few rumors, and the whole village turned against her." Another accomplice, Diego, chimed in. "It wouldn't have been any different with another girl. Women here only know how to obey." Alexander laughed heartily, showing no trace of regret. "People believe what they want to believe. Isabel wasn't important anyway. She should be grateful I even let her live." In the opulent room, their laughter echoed, a stark contrast to Isabel's struggles in the city. Alexander remained confident that his family's wealth and influence would shield him from any consequences. He never imagined he would one day have to pay for his actions. Meanwhile, in the city, Isabel continued her relentless work. The long days at Senora Rosa's eatery not only provided her with an income but also built her patience and resilience. Over time, Senora Rosa grew to trust Isabel more, assigning her more significant responsibilities. One evening, as the eatery was quiet, Senora Rosa sat down beside Isabel, her gaze thoughtful. "Isabel, do you plan to live like this forever?" she asked, her tone gentle but piercing. Isabel was taken aback. I don't know. I just want my father not to suffer anymore." Senora Rosa stared at her intently. "You're smart and hardworking. But working here won't change anything. You need to do something to change your life." Isabel remained silent, her thoughts swirling. Senora Rosa's words awakened something in her. For so long, she had been focused on survival, never thinking about standing up for herself. That night, Isabel sat by the window of their small room, her eyes fixed on the dark sky. She thought of Alexander's cold gaze, his mocking laughter, and the look of helplessness in her father's eyes when faced with the landlord's power. "No. I can't let him live peacefully like this," Isabel whispered, her eyes gleaming with determination. Isabel began to think of ways to gather information about Alexander. She knew that to take revenge, she needed evidence, not just of what he had done to her but of his wrongdoings to others as well. But how could she get close to Alexander when he was far away and surrounded by power? The next day, Isabel started asking around about wealthy families from the countryside who had moved to the city for business. She overheard customers at the eatery mentioning that Alexander's family had dealings with some merchants in the city. A middle-aged customer remarked to his companion, "I heard the Stephen family is investing in the wine industry. Their son Alexander often attends big parties." Isabel noted this information. She realized this could be her chance to learn more about Alexander. That evening, Isabel approached Senora Rosa. "Senora Rosa, I'd like to find an extra job at night. Do you know of any places that need help?" Senora Rosa frowned. "An extra job? What kind of work?" "I've heard there are many large parties that need servers. I'd like to apply for those." Senora Rosa thought for a moment before nodding. I know a few places. But those aren't easy jobs, Isabel. Isabel smiled faintly, her eyes resolute. I'm not afraid. A few days later, Isabel secured a job as a server at an upscale restaurant that often hosted events for the elite. The grand parties, the elegantly dressed guests, and the dazzling lights, it was a world entirely foreign to her. Dressed in a simple server's uniform, Isabel moved quietly among the noisy crowd, always keeping her head down and maintaining a humble demeanor. But her eyes never stopped observing. One evening, as Isabel was carrying a tray of wine, she heard a familiar voice from a distant corner of the room. Alexander, don't you ever think about settling down? A middle-aged man asked. Alexander laughed, and the sound sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. He was here. Settle down. Women are just ornaments. I don't need any extra trouble, Alexander replied, taking a sip of wine, his tone dripping with arrogance. Isabel quietly stepped into a shadowed corner, watching him. Alexander was still the same, arrogant, ruthless, and conceited. But Isabel no longer felt fear. Instead, the flames of hatred in her heart burned even hotter. Isabel vowed, he will pay. Not just for what he did to me, but for all the others he has trampled on. From that moment, Isabel began secretly gathering information about Alexander's business dealings. She listened closely to the drunken chatter of patrons, the careless words of other servers, and every stray comment that passed her way. Slowly, a picture of Alexander's lavish lifestyle and shady connections began to take shape in her mind. She knew that to bring down someone like Alexander, emotions alone wouldn't suffice. She needed a plan, evidence, and most importantly, patience. Isabel whispered to herself, the day will come when he kneels before justice. Months passed, and Isabel became accustomed to working at the luxurious parties. She remained quiet, diligently observing and memorizing every detail about Alexander. Under the glittering lights, he always appeared polished and confident, with his arrogant smile and haughty words. Alexander had no memory of his past sins and no idea that Isabel was now so close. One evening, at a grand party hosted by a major wine corporation, Alexander arrived alongside an older man with an air of authority. As Isabel poured wine for other guests, she overheard fragments of their conversation. Mr. Richard, this deal will bring great profits to both sides, Alexander said confidently, sipping his wine. The man, Richard, nodded slightly. But I've heard rumors about the quality of your family's products. Don't let such talk tarnish your reputation. Alexander smirked. Just rumors. There will always be envious people spreading lies. From a distance, Isabel watched Alexander intently, catching every word. She committed Richard's name to memory, a key lead that could open doors to taking down Alexander. After the party, Isabel carefully recorded everything she had gathered in a small notebook. She realized Alexander was more than just an arrogant man, behind his glamorous facade were shady dealings. She needed to uncover his weaknesses. One day, as Isabel was cleaning the last table at Senora Rosa's eatery, a stranger entered. He wore a worn coat, his appearance rugged but his eyes sharp. "Excuse me, is Isabel working here?" he asked in a low voice. Isabel looked up, surprised. "Yes, that's me. What do you want?" The man glanced around cautiously before lowering his voice. "My name is Lawrence. I used to manage the warehouse for Alexander's family winery. I know things about him." Isabel froze, her heart racing. "What do you mean? What things?" Lawrence sighed. Alexander used substandard materials to produce wine. He bribed inspectors to cover it up. I protested, but he fired me. Isabel clenched her fists. This was exactly what she had been searching for, evidence of Alexander's crimes. "Do you have proof?" she asked urgently. Lawrence nodded. "I kept some documents and invoices. But I'm afraid to go public. His family is too powerful. Isabel looked him in the eye. I'll help you. We need to expose him. Lawrence hesitated for a moment before nodding. If you're serious about this, I'll show you everything. That night, Isabel quietly left her boarding room and followed Lawrence to a small apartment in an old neighborhood. He opened a worn wooden chest and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers. These are invoices for materials from an unlicensed supplier. And here are forged order forms with the director's signature, Lawrence explained. Isabel carefully examined each page. Every line, every figure was irrefutable evidence. We have to bring this to light, Isabel said, her eyes shining with determination. It won't be easy, Lawrence warned. Alexander has connections with officials. If we're not careful, we could be in danger. Isabel remained silent, fully aware of the risks. But she couldn't stop now, she had endured far too much. In the following days, Isabel sought out the press. She heard of a journalist named Javier, known for his investigative reports on corruption and corporate scandals. Isabel went to the newspaper office, carrying copies of the documents. Javier, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, looked at her skeptically. Where did you get these? Isabel recounted her entire story, from being victimized by Alexander to her efforts to gather evidence. Javier listened in silence before nodding. If this is true, I'll help you. But you need to be prepared. The truth always comes at a high price. Isabel didn't hesitate. I've been prepared for a long time. Javier began a deep investigation into Alexander's business dealings. Meanwhile, Isabel continued gathering more information. Each step she took was no longer an act of survival but a journey to reclaim justice. Unaware of the storm brewing against him, Alexander continued indulging in extravagant parties and basking in false flattery. One evening, as Alexander raised his glass to toast with business partners, he had no idea that elsewhere in the city, articles exposing his crimes were being prepared. Standing on the rooftop of a building, Isabel felt the cold wind blowing through her hair. She gazed at the city's dazzling lights, her heart consumed by a singular determination. Alexander will pay for everything. The fire of revenge burning within Isabel was no longer a fleeting anger. It had become her life's purpose, not only to seek justice for herself but to protect others from predators like Alexander. Clutching the notebook where she had recorded all her findings, Isabel whispered, "He won't be able to hide forever." She turned and descended the staircase, ready for the next phase of her plan. Her figure melted into the night, stronger and more resolute than ever. The atmosphere in St. Mary was unusually lively that day. Villagers gathered in the central square, buzzing with curiosity. News of an unexpected meeting organized by a mysterious woman had spread throughout the village. No one could have guessed that the woman was Isabel, once an outcast, now returning with a completely transformed presence. Isabel stepped out of a luxurious car, her elegant demeanor exuding authority. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, and her refined dress emphasized her confidence. Walking beside her was Mr. Philip, now old and frail but with eyes brimming with pride. Every gaze followed Isabel's every step, filled with astonishment. Señora Carmen, who had once pitied Isabel, clutched her chest, overwhelmed with emotion. "Is it really Isabel?" she whispered, her hands trembling. From a distance, Alexander watched the scene, his face pale. He couldn't believe his eyes. Isabel, the woman he had trampled, had returned, commanding respect and power. Standing beside him was Mark, who looked equally unsettled. "What the hell is going on, Alexander?" Mark whispered. Alexander gritted his teeth, his expression icy. "She's just trying to draw attention. There's nothing to worry about." But deep down, Alexander felt a creeping unease. Isabel ascended the platform in the center of the square, where a microphone had been set up. The murmurs gradually subsided as all eyes focused on her. "Hello everyone," Isabel began, her voice clear and strong. "I am Isabel, the daughter of Mr. Philip. Today, I have not returned to dwell on the past but to reveal the truth that has been ignored for far too long. The crowd fell silent, a mix of curiosity and unease in their expressions. Isabel held up a stack of documents. These are the proofs that Alexander has committed fraud in his business, using substandard materials to produce wine. Not only that, but he has also bribed officials to cover up his actions. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. The villagers, who had always seen Alexander as the landlord's son, were stunned by these accusations. Alexander stepped forward, trying to maintain his composure. "What nonsense are you spouting, Isabel? Do you think a few worthless papers can bring me down?" Isabel stared at him, her gaze unwavering. "These are not just papers. Listen to the testimony of someone who worked directly for Alexander's winery, Mr. Lawrence." From the crowd, Lawrence stepped forward, his face resolute. "I used to be the warehouse manager at Alexander's winery. I personally witnessed Alexander importing low-quality materials and bribing inspectors. All the evidence is here." Alexander's face turned pale. He glanced at Mark, stammering, "How did he dare to show up here?" Mark shook his head, speechless. Isabel continued, her voice cold. "And that's not all. Alexander is also the man who assaulted me. He and his group lured me to an abandoned house and committed crimes for which he has never been held accountable." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some women covered their mouths in horror, while several men frowned in anger. "I was cast out by this village because of the lies he spread," Isabel said loudly, her voice trembling but full of resolve. "But I haven't returned to ask for pity, I've returned to demand justice." The crowd's shock slowly turned to outrage. A middle-aged man raised his fist and shouted, "Alexander! Did you really commit such heinous acts?" Senora Carmen, trembling, spoke up. "I always suspected something was wrong, but I never imagined it was this terrible." Alexander took a step back, cold sweat dripping down his face. "Don't believe her. She's fabricating lies to ruin me." Isabel smirked and pulled out her phone. "If words aren't enough, who will you believe? But here's a recording of Alexander and his friends boasting about what they did back then." The recording played in the middle of the square. "Who does Isabel think she is? We were just having some fun. It's her fault for standing against me." The crowd erupted in fury. Every eye turned on Alexander, seething with anger. "That bastard needs to be punished," a man shouted. "Call the police." "Don't let him get away," another yelled. At that moment, the police arrived. Officer Miguel stepped forward, his expression stern. "Alexander Stephen, you are under arrest for commercial fraud and sexual assault. Please come with us." Alexander struggled, yelling, "No. You can't do this to me. My father won't let this stand." Miguel coldly handcuffed him. "No one is above the law." Alexander was dragged away amidst the villagers' shouts of outrage. The crowd cheered, and those who once doubted Isabel now looked at her with admiration. Mr. Philip stood beside his daughter, his eyes glistening with tears. "You did it, Isabel." Isabel turned to her father, a soft smile on her face. "This is just the beginning, father." After Alexander's arrest, silence fell over the square in St. Mary. The villagers were still processing the horrifying truths that had just been unveiled. Isabel stood tall on the platform, her gaze resolute as it swept over the crowd. She had not only reclaimed justice for herself but had shattered the long-standing fear of the Stephen family's power. Mr. Philip gripped her hand tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Isabel." Isabel smiled faintly, her eyes shining with determination. "I couldn't let him continue to hurt others, father. But this isn't over yet. He must be held fully accountable." Senora Carmen approached through the crowd, her eyes red with tears. "Isabel. I'm so sorry. We all turned our backs on you. I regret it deeply. Isabel responded gently, her voice free of bitterness. I don't blame anyone, Senora. Alexander used his power to hide his crimes. Now that the truth is out, we need to look forward. Suddenly, a middle-aged man named Thomas, who had worked as the Stephen family's longtime steward, stepped forward. His eyes were heavy with guilt. Isabel. I worked for the Stephen family for years, and I knew about many wrongdoings. But I was too afraid to speak up. Now that Alexander has been arrested, I want to help you. Isabel looked at him calmly. If you know anything more, please share it. We need to ensure he can't escape justice. Thomas nodded. Alexander didn't just commit business fraud. He exploited workers at the winery, firing them without cause and even having some beaten when they resisted. The crowd buzzed again, their anger growing. Isabel clenched her fists. These injustices must come to light. We won't let him harm anyone else. At the police station, Alexander sat in a holding cell, furiously banging on the metal door. Do you people even know who I am? My father won't let this slide. Officer Miguel entered, his demeanor calm. Your father can't cover up your crimes anymore. We have solid evidence. Alexander sneered. Those papers mean nothing. Miguel tossed a stack of documents onto the table. It's not just papers. We have witnesses and recordings. Alexander Stephen, you will face the law. Alexander froze, fear creeping into his expression. He had never imagined being backed into such a corner. A week later, news of Alexander's arrest spread like wildfire. Headlines plastered across newspapers read, Landlord's son Alexander Stephen arrested for fraud and assault. The oppressive shadow of the Stephen family's power over St. Mary began to lift. Villagers started to speak out. Many of Alexander's past victims came forward, recounting his cruelty. A young woman named Mariana broke down as she described being threatened by Alexander after rejecting him. I was terrified and couldn't say anything, Mariana sobbed. But thanks to Isabel, I finally have the courage to stand up. Isabel stood beside Mariana, holding her hand firmly. No one has to stay silent anymore. We will fight together. At the same time, the Stephen family began to crumble. Alexander's father, Stephen, faced mounting accusations from business partners and workers. Many contracts were cancelled, and their assets were frozen. The arrogance he once exuded had vanished, replaced by worry and rage. In his office, papers strewn everywhere, Stephen slammed his fist on the desk. How did this get so out of control? A nervous lawyer standing beside him stammered, Sir, the evidence against Alexander is overwhelming. We can't intervene. Stephen roared, This is impossible. I won't let everything slip away like this. But now, his power and wealth were no longer enough to cover up his son's wrongdoings. Meanwhile, Isabel didn't stop at bringing Alexander to justice. She decided to use the experience and resources she had gained to build a women's support center in St. Mary. The center would not only provide protection but also empower women. On the day of the center's inauguration, the villagers gathered in large numbers. A sign above the door read, Isabel Women's Support Center, a place for protection and empowerment. Senora Carmen wiped her tears. Isabel, you're amazing. You've turned your pain into strength. Isabel smiled and held her father's hand. I don't want anyone to go through what I did. We must make a change. Mr. Philip looked at his daughter with warmth in his eyes. You've done something I never even dared to dream of. Lucia also approached, her voice filled with emotion. Isabel, no one in this village will ever dare to look down on women again. Isabel turned to the villagers and raised her voice. We have stayed silent for too long. From now on, no one will be allowed to trample on the dignity of others. Applause rang out loud and clear. The villagers no longer looked at Isabel with pity but with respect and gratitude. One afternoon, Isabel sat with Mr. Philip under the large tree in front of their house. The golden hues of sunset bathed the fields. "Father, I've finally come back." But not with fear, this time, with strength, Isabel said softly. Mr. Philip gently squeezed her hand. "You've overcome everything, Isabel." Looking up at the vast sky, Isabel smiled tenderly. "I believe Mother would be proud of me." In the distance, the Women's Support Center glowed warmly in the twilight. A new chapter of hope had begun in St. Mary. 3 months after Alexander's arrest, St. Mary underwent a remarkable transformation. No longer weighed down by gossip or fear of the Stephen family's power, the village was now filled with trust and hope. The Isabel Women's Support Center became a safe haven for vulnerable women. On the first day of classes at the center, Isabel stood before a group of women of all ages, each carrying their own stories and pain. Smiling gently, she spoke with a firm yet kind tone. "Today is not a day for me to talk about my past," Isabel began. "It's a day for us to move forward together, stronger than before." Among the group was Mariana, the young woman who had once been too afraid to speak out against Alexander. Now, she was more confident, her eyes no longer avoiding others. Mariana spoke up, her voice timid but resolute. "Isabel, thank you for giving me and so many others a chance to start over." Isabel nodded gently. "None of us have to live in pain forever. Together, we'll create change." Meanwhile, in the city, Alexander faced a public trial. The courtroom was packed, with journalists, villagers from St. Mary, and many of his victims in attendance. Alexander appeared in prison attire, a stark contrast to his once glamorous image. His head hung low, and there was no trace of his former arrogance. Beside him sat his lawyer, but the panic in Alexander's eyes revealed that he knew no one could save him this time. The judge regarded him sternly. "Defendant Alexander Stephen, with the evidence and testimonies presented, you are charged with commercial fraud, sexual assault, and threatening others." Alexander tried to remain composed, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Isabel sat in the front row, her gaze steady and fearless. Beside her were Lawrence and other victims. The truth had come to light, and justice was finally being served. Although Alexander's lawyer attempted to defend him, his words were futile against the overwhelming evidence. The recordings, Lawrence's testimony, and statements from Thomas and other victims exposed Alexander's crimes in full. At last, the judge delivered the verdict. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the court sentences Alexander Stephen to 25 years in prison without parole. Applause erupted throughout the courtroom. Alexander sat frozen, then slumped over the table, defeated. He knew it was the end. Isabel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. A sense of relief washed over her. Justice had finally been served. After the trial, Isabel returned to St. Mary. The village no longer buzzed with malicious gossip. Instead, it welcomed her warmly. Villagers gathered at the Women's Support Center, where Isabel held a small ceremony to thank those who had supported her. Señora Carmen approached, taking Isabel's hand. "You've changed this village, Isabel. Because of you, we're no longer afraid." Isabel smiled. "It wasn't just me, Señora. Everyone worked together to make this change." Lucia chimed in happily. "You know, young girls in the village no longer fear being oppressed. They're starting to study and pursue their dreams." Looking around at the radiant faces, Isabel's heart swelled with warmth. "That's the best thing of all," Isabel replied softly. From a distance, Mr. Philip watched his daughter, his eyes filled with pride. He was no longer the weary man constantly worrying about his daughter. Now, he was happy to see Isabel find justice and create a meaningful life. One evening, Isabel and Mr. Philip sat under the large tree, gazing at the Women's Support Center. Children played in the fields, their laughter echoing across the land. "You've done something I never dared to dream of," Mr. Philip said warmly. You've changed an entire community. Isabel turned to him, smiling. Father, you've always been my strength. Without you, I couldn't have made it here. Mr. Philip nodded, his calloused hand clasping hers. Now, all I wish is for you to always be happy. Isabel looked out at the golden fields, peace washing over her. All the pain and injustice had been erased, replaced by hope for a brighter future. As time passed, the Isabel Women's Support Center grew. Women from nearby areas came seeking help. Isabel expanded its offerings, adding vocational training classes and counseling sessions to help women reclaim their sense of worth. One morning, Isabel received a letter. It was from Mariana, the young woman she had helped. Dear Isabel. Because of you, I found the courage to stand up. I've just received a scholarship to study law. I want to become a lawyer, like the ones who helped me. I want to protect the vulnerable, just as you did for me. Thank you so much. Mariana. As Isabel finished reading, a bright smile spread across her face. The letter was a reminder that her journey was far from over. She knew there were still many people in need of help. Standing up, Isabel looked toward the support center. Her voice rang out with conviction. We won't stop here. There's still so much more to do. Beneath the morning sun, Isabel walked forward, carrying unwavering faith in justice and humanity. Isabel's story teaches a profound lesson about the power of perseverance and justice. Despite facing injustice, pain, and rejection, she stood strong and fought to reclaim her honor and bring justice to her community. Her journey reminds us that power and wealth cannot hide the truth forever, and those who commit crimes will eventually face consequences. Most importantly, it highlights how unity and courage can transform an entire society.